in 2021 with our response to the first Just Transition Commission's final report. And it's really sort of building on work that's been happening in our legislation beforehand, which I'll come to shortly. So really it's about uniting our economic, social and climate objectives, and it really aims to empower all to play a part in the country's net zero transition, as well as ensuring those who are most impacted are at the heart of the conversation. Just transition really needs to account for differing risks and opportunities as well. So I mentioned the legislation, the definition and our response to the Just Transition Commission really builds on our legislation. So 2019, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Act was revised, increasing the ambition of Scotland's emissions reductions targets, but also embedding the principles of a just transition into the Act. So there's specific requirements for the climate change plan to explain how the proposals and policies set out in the plan are expected to affect different sectors of the economy and different regions, and the proposals and policies for supporting the workforce, employees and employers and communities in those sections and regions. The just transition principles, just to sort of go over those very quickly, are the importance of taking action to reduce net Scottish emissions of greenhouse gases in a way which supports environmentally and socially sustainable jobs, supports low carbon investment and infrastructure, develops and maintains social consensus for engagement with workers, trade unions, communities, non-government organisations, representatives of the interests of business and industry, and such other persons as the Scottish ministers consider appropriate. Creates decent, fair, and high value work in a way which does not negatively affect the current workforce and overall economy, and contributes to resource efficient and sustainable economic approaches which help to address inequality and poverty. Um, our National Just Transition Planning Framework includes National Just Transition outcomes, which really build on these principles, and I have a slide on those in a few moments. So what we're here to talk about today is really just transition planning and our commitment to deliver just transition plans for sectors, sites and regions. Currently, we're focusing on sectoral just transition plans. These are the built environment and construction just transition plan, the land use and agriculture just transition plan, and the transport just transition plan, which is the focus of today's session. We've published just discussion papers in advance of developing policies to help with the effective engagement and co-design. Um, so as well as setting out our National Just Transition Planning Framework in 2021, we also had a renewed Just Transition Commission set up to advise and scrutinise us on our Just Transition planning. So the first commission was really focusing on gathering an evidence base around what just transition policy is and what's needed to be part of the just transition agenda. This commission is really focusing on scrutinising our approach and advising us as we go on. The way that we work with the commission is to really work with them throughout the process rather than just when we publish documents. So we've already had quite a lot of advice from the commission so far. And some of their expectations of just transition plans are that they set out a vision for just transition in the sector, including illustrative journeys, set out the existing evidence base in one place, including identifying gaps because there will be gaps, and demonstrating where co-design has informed policy development, uh, highlighting the priorities for policy development, although these may be revised throughout engagement, and setting out a strategic roadmap for how these policies will collectively deliver our outcomes. Oh, sorry, skipped ahead there. So essentially, this advice is really coming back to what the purpose of just transition plans is, which is they should be providing certainty for those involved in the transition and ensuring everyone understands the active role they can play in the transition, which is really around the clarity and setting out where interventions are likely to happen and giving enough advance notice. And then finally, identifying and mitigating economic or social injustice, which may be exacerbated by climate action. So earlier I mentioned the just transition principles in the Climate Change Act. and then that Just Transition Planning Framework had 8 outcomes that we're working towards to achieve a just transition. We've distilled these down into 4 outcomes just to make them more manageable and group them together where it feels that they might work better together. So we've now got jobs, skills and economic opportunities, communities and places, people and equity, and environment, biodiversity and adaptation. And ideally, all our just transition plans must show how they're delivering and monitoring progress against each of these outcomes. One thing really to note, as Judy mentioned earlier on, that this engagement also inform our adaptation programme. We're really working to establish links between just transition and adaptation work, as there are quite a lot of links, and particularly in the equity side, and that's why we've included that as an outcome here. So we've published 3 discussion papers in June to support engagement on the development of the 3 just transition plans. These were informed by early engagement with stakeholders and the Just Transition Commission. Essentially, we put in our best understanding of what the priorities are for each just transition plan, although we're really these aren't necessarily set in stone. They're intended to inform and encourage conversations by giving some more detail rather than just opening up a very high level discussion. And we really want our engagement period to either confirm these or challenge those so that we can refine what the priorities are and actually co-design those priorities as well. So we're currently undergoing engagement for the Just Transition Plan. So we've been engaging with citizens and consumers, with particular interest groups. This is the public sector engagement, and there's also a business engagement taking place shortly. This is just to demonstrate the timeline for just transition planning and to sort of focus on the fact that all just transition plans must be evidence-led, adaptable and iterative, co-designed and co-delivered and built upon existing work and experience. And this is really to build on what's been done elsewhere in government, elsewhere in the public sector, and bring it all together so that we can have quite a comprehensive sectoral just transition plan. And so now moving on to the Transport Just Transition Plan, these are the emerging policy priorities and themes from the discussion paper. And I think at this point I might pause and see if Bertrand wants to come in and say anything on this before he presents.
Thank you, Natalie. And good morning, everybody. I'm Bertrand Dess from Transport Scotland in the Climate Change and Just Transition Unit. As you can see on this slide, we've got the 4 major themes, and my presentation after Natalie will be really focused on theme 1, especially with regard to what we call demand management. And my presentation wants to really clarify what Scottish Government Transport Scotland means by transport demand management, and an element of it, which is road user charging. Thank you. What the previous slide was showing is the transport just transition doesn't want to exacerbate the current inequalities, and this slide really depicts the current inequalities. And in terms of road use, you can focus on the top right corner with the car travel, and I'd like you to see that 60% of households on lowest income don't have access to a car, as well as those living in the most deprived areas are more likely to walk or catch the bus than drive a car. Next slide, Nat. So we need to reduce our reliance on cars primarily to help tackle the climate change. Transport is Scotland's biggest sectoral emitter, accounting to nearly 30% of Scotland's greenhouse gas emission. And within that, car travel makes up nearly 41% of transport emission in 2021. Modeling work is clear that technological solutions alone, such as electric cars, will not be enough to meet our commitment to net zero by 2045 compared to 1990. We need to reduce the use of cars, as well as supporting a transition to lower emission vehicles for the remaining cars. Behavioral change will also be fundamental requirement to achieve this reduction in car use. By reducing car use, we mean encouraging car drivers to use more often public transport or to walk, wheel and cycle, but also on discouraging car drivers to use their cars. This is where transport demand management comes in, particularly road user charging. Natalie, next slide, please. We also need to reduce our reliance on cars to help people live better lives through improved health and well-being and greater social and economic inclusion. This slide shows the co-benefit of reducing our reliance on car use. So I don't run through them, but you can see reducing our car use will improve the air quality, avoid road collisions, improve physical activity, improve on the noise pollution, and improve in reducing the community severance, and so on and so forth. But importantly, these negative impacts all disproportionately affect those who are already more vulnerable. So reducing car use is a key part of Scottish Government's commitment to reducing inequalities. On this slide, you can see that transport management, demand management is the use of strategies and policies to support and encourage travelers to maximize efficiency of the transport system in order to improve mobility, reduce congestions, and lower emissions, vehicle emissions. Examples of transport demand management are either measures to encourage car sharing, the use of active travel and public transport, as well as measures to discourage car use, such as road user charging. And there are two types of road user charging, either based on distance or based on areas where it can be called congestion charge, but also other types of intervention. And this could cover parking charges, road space reallocation, reducing the road space for cars, for example, to increase road space for public and active travel. Another intervention is road tolls and low emission zones. Next slide is showing the first type of road user charging, which is based on distance driven or based, and this is based in the New Zealand example, where you can see this RUC scheme ask anyone driving a diesel vehicle or a vehicle with a fuel not taxed at source, regardless of the weight of the vehicle, to pay. So in the case of a diesel vehicle, you can see it's $76 for each 1,000 kilometers driven. The scheme is administered through onboard distance-based recording device. Electric cars are exempt. Next slide is depicting the other type of road user charging, which is based on a defined geographic area. And the whole principle of congestion charging on road pricing is a means of managing the harmful impact of traffic by expecting that an increase in the cost of driving will reduce car-based demand. There are a number of schemes in operation around the world in the form of charging or permit systems, and a number of cities are considering potential implementation. The schemes in operation demonstrate a significant reduction in traffic volumes between 10 and 38%, and a transport-related emissions reduction from 2 to 35% in CO2. Next slide. Here I show you more in depth the case study of Milan cordon charge. Milan has been implemented a cordon charge since I think 2000 and something, where a €5 daily charge is applied to vehicles entering the city center, which is depicted here in green. It's called the Area C. And as you can see, it's quite limited in distance, roughly 2 to 3 kilometers in diameter. Various exemptions were made for non-polluting vehicles, taxis, public transport, disabled persons parking card holders, and residents of the Area C, for example, have 40 free accesses per year, then pay a reduced fee of €2 thereafter. Motorists must obtain a ticket from a meter or a designated shop or via the Italian electronic toll tag system called Telepass. The system is monitored by cameras. Some allowances have been made for city center businesses. For example, the charging hours are curtailed on Thursday evening to support late night shopping. There is no indication that the scheme has resulted in increased parking around the edge of the zone or a modal shift to public transport. The reduction in traffic is being attributed to lower levels of through traffic. All the incomes from Area C have been reinvested in projects for sustainable mobility. So, for example, 62% of the money raised went to strengthening public transport in order to improve frequency. 22% went into developing sustainable mobility projects, and the remaining 16% is to administer the Gordon charge, 16%. The scheme also demonstrated how implementing vehicle restrictions in historic city centers can have marked benefits for pedestrians and cyclists and improve the economic vibrancy of the city center. Next slide is now based on the London area based charge, which has been put in place since 2003 by Transport for London. The London scheme uses ANPR cameras as enforcement, which requires significant capital investment to install and a large back office requirement for successful operation. The scheme had the following impacts. It reduced the volume of traffic entering the charging zone by 31%. However, its impact has diminished over time, with a particular exemption for taxis, resulting in more congestion and reducing bus patronage as apps such as Uber have grown. The scheme had positive environmental impacts with NO nitrate of oxide and particulate matter, decreasing by 18% and 20% respectively. The CO2 itself reduced by 16%. The scheme had a net income of 156 million, which within which 51% is spent on collection costs, so that you've got an idea of how much it costs to administer the scheme. But in the overall revenue of TfL budget, this congestion charge is around 21% of Transport for London street budget. The scheme had between 40 and 70% fewer accidents, which resulted in personal injury within the zone. And finally, economic benefits for businesses and freight operators were seen, as better network performance resulted in journey time reduction. And my final slide is about the public acceptability of road user charging, which shows that it varies. And you may know that in 2005 in Edinburgh, a Gordon scheme was proposed, voted on in a referendum and rejected. There are many factors identified in the rejection of this scheme, including perceptions on unfairness and a lack of clarity on what the revenue generated would be used for. But conversely, 62% of members of Scotland's Climate Assembly agreed their recommendation to increase road tax to subsidize public transport in June 2021, and it is the little box on the right-hand side of this slide. Finally, there is also evidence that public acceptance increases post-implementation of a scheme. And in the example of London, prior to implementation, the support for congestion charging was 40%, which rose to 59% post-implementation. And that concludes my quick briefing and I hope it was helpful to really understand what we mean by transport demand management on the one hand and road user charging on the other. Thank you.